I've been a filmmaker and a reporter started at the Herald and then with the Canadian Press, the news agency, and then with the CBC. And my job for the last 13 years in reporting was reporting the world events to Canada. And like any person who must follow the style guides of the Canadian Press or the CBC, you try to come as close to what you think is the truth. And you can be in a discussion about balance, you can be in a discussion about bias, but really it's trying conscientiously to be fair, to give both sides of issues, or many sides of an issue, an opportunity to tell their story. I have found, in my experience, that more intelligent and better educated publics have grown to be able to recognize, the freshness of the fish, regardless of what it's wrapped in.
Okay. Well, Town Point Consulting was simply a company I formed when I retired from my career to enable some of my former clients to still access my services. And so it's served that purpose and still does today. That company didn't contemplate at its origin anything to do with oysters, but a number of years ago, the genesis of Town Point Oysters came out of discussions we had with our two sons, who brought up the idea that we should explore the opportunity to have a family business related to oyster aquaculture in Antigonish harbour. So then Jane and I spent a year looking at the oyster aquaculture industry, considering the regulatory process, the demand for oysters, how the harvesting and farming of oysters works, the science behind oyster aquaculture, a lot of different factors. And everywhere we looked, the indicators pointed in a positive direction, supporting the notion that this was a good opportunity. And so as a family, we decided that we would stick our oar in the water, no pun intended, and take a crack at submitting an application to have an oyster aquaculture operation in Antigonish harbour.
Yeah, I guess we're an association or organization that formed in response to finding out about the potential oyster aquaculture development. Many of the residents of the area, although not all of them, were taken to meet the potential developer, who explained to us what they were going to be doing. And then naturally, as neighbors, we began to talk amongst ourselves. And there were certain features of the story that didn't really add up to us or didn't make sense. And we felt like all of our concerns weren't being answered as individuals. So we thought that maybe getting together, we'd be able to find out more about what was happening and voice our objections a little bit more forcefully.
So the Friends of Antigonish Harbour is a local community group, and a number of people are naturalists. Some of them are local businessmen, local farmers, local people who own property around the harbour. And they feel that this is an imposition on both their rights to use the harbour and on the biological nature of the harbour itself. So the feeling is that putting in an oyster farm in Antigonish Harbour would severely disrupt the ecology and would severely disrupt their enjoyment of the harbour itself in terms of the activities that they would want to do.
What are some of the major red flags that come up to you with the proposed development?
I actually have a lot of them. I think it's pretty clear there's environmental risk. It's true that there is scientific evidence for some beneficial effects of some oyster farms in some environments, but I would argue not in a clean environment like this one. Most of that work has been done on harbors that have serious problems, or not only harbors but bays with heavy metals and excess sediment and nutrient loading, none of which are true of Antigonish Harbour. I wonder how fair it is that the outer harbour, which is used by all kinds of people for both recreation and economic reasons, that such a large part of it should be taken away for what is essentially a private interest. The size is a problem, and I have to wonder whether the community has actually really been dealt fairly with in terms of the provision of information and the willingness to engage and transparency about this project over the year and a half more than a year and a half now that we've been looking at it.
Well, the role that oysters play as filter feeders is extremely complex. And I think one of the things that's important to consider here is that the actual history of the harbour. And in pre-colonial days, there were two things that were absolutely noted about these estuaries in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence. One of them was they were extremely rich in terms of the eelgrass beds. And the second thing was that they had truly abundant oysters, and there were oyster reefs throughout many of these harbors. So we had large numbers of oysters and then large amounts of eelgrass in this system. And it was clearly biologically very diverse, and the waters would have been relatively clean. They would have been clean. I mean, there was no pollution per se. There was virtually no development around the harbor. So there's an historical context, and we now come into a sort of a more a more recent sort of perspective on the harbor, where we have a community of colonists, okay, that have built houses and properties, and they use that harbor for recreation, they use it for swimming, they use it for boating, they use it for studying natural history. And we have, it's a fascinating biological system.
The question is, what really is the nutrient load in that system? And to a certain extent, I watched it here in Pomket Harbor as well. The plant life and the animal life, the microscopic zooplankton, whatever you want to call it, can respond to increased nutrients and get it into the food chain up to a certain point. Basically, there's a reason to say that oysters might clean up some of the excess, but we don't know whether it's excess or whether it's being all used. And if there is excess, or if it's being used, and the oyster farm goes in, then it's going to take up a lot more of the nutrients or the microscopic life in the harbor, and something else is not going to get it.
The Antigonish Harbor Watershed Association is the local NGO that participates with DFO in that. So we've been collecting data on the harbor since 2006, although I've only been here for 10 years, so I wasn't there in 2006, but since 2010, I've been a part of that. The camp data is limited. We are collecting data just off the shore. So all the fish sampling, the water sampling, the vegetation observations are within 15 meters of the shoreline. So we don't really have anything to say about what is going on in the middle of the outer harbor, for example. What the camp data show are that this harbor is one of the cleanest of the 36 campsites. We have high diversity of species, high abundance of species. We have levels of dissolved oxygen, which is actually an indicator of the negative impact of nutrient loading. Our dissolved oxygen levels are good to very good to excellent, I would say. We know there are no heavy metals in the water because there's no heavy industry and there's no heavy metal geology. Sediment, we have no evidence of sediment staying in the harbor for any length of time. Most of the time we're sampling, the water is clear, even including after smaller rainstorms. After a very large rainstorm, there will be sediment in the water, but it disappears quite quickly. We have a place on the form where we're supposed to be observing excessive green algae, and in 5 years, we haven't noticed that once. So if nutrient loading is a problem, you get growth of algae, and we see algae sometimes. I mean, there's a bit here, there's a bit there in out of the way places, but it's not a problem in the harbor generally. So the question becomes, what are the oysters taking out that isn't excessive? They're feeding on elements in the water that other biological life forms are feeding on as well. And what, to talk about cleaner water is probably not correct. It's the estuary is healthy, but when you talk about cleaner water, the question is cleaner than what? And if we had distilled water in the harbor, there would be no life at all. So if the oysters aren't taking out excessive, which we don't have, then they're taking out possibly needed nutrients for other life forms. There actually isn't really a lot of study that's been made of the ecology of the harbor, so we don't really know what could happen. There's plenty of evidence that bad things have happened around oyster farms. So we don't know, and so it becomes an environmental risk.
Well, I cannot predict the effects that potential oyster farm will have, given the fact that we have an awful lot of pollution coming in terms of people sort of from farms, especially cattle. We have runoff from Antigonish sewer systems and anybody else that's living around the harbor that's, whose septic system isn't quite up to scratch. And we can see, that the water is sometimes very cloudy. Okay. Now, that's an overabundance of nutrients that is in part causing that. And it means that we have a lot of phytoplankton as a consequence. And there's no reason why oysters wouldn't feed on that and reduce the amount of phytoplankton, which would in fact suck up an awful lot of these nutrients. So there's in some ways a positive thing that would take the harbour back from where it is now in terms of nutrient loading, because it would clearly take out an awful lot of those nutrients and put them into a biological system.
Now the effect on eelgrass is also, that's like a species of plant underwater that is just like a forest for a lot of small animals and microscopic organisms that need a substrate to attach to. So the shade effect is another aspect to it. And I'm just not certain if the spacing's right. It might not be too serious a matter. But there's just a lot of unknowns.
So where we were told that the development was going to happen right in front of Captain's Island right there. And since the publication of the application, that turns out to be true, that it is supposed to be in front of Captain's Island. But anyone who sails or uses that area knows that it's very difficult to actually navigate because it is so shallow, and it is actually a significant eelgrass bed in the harbor. And that was concerning to a lot of people because eelgrass has really only started since the 70s to come back to Antigonish Harbour, and it forms really the basis of the whole ecosystem. And not only does it form the basis of just the general ecosystem, but it's really important for a lot of endangered species. So for instance, the white hake of the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence is an endangered species. And there are studies from 2013 which showed that white hake go into shallow estuaries and go into the eelgrass beds as juveniles, and that's where they kind of take shelter and grow up. So it's this really important habitat for the white hake in their, formative years. But a development on top of the eelgrass threatens to damage that whole environment.
Well, there's no question if you put a blanket over an eelgrass bed and you shade out the light, there is going to be a reduction in light, and that the eelgrass will not grow as well. I mean, it does essentially require, full sunlight imposing on these shallow water systems. And while that is true, the question is exactly how much of the harbor is going to be impacted by the physical structures that Town Point Consulting wants to put in aid of its oyster farm. And I've seen the maps, I've seen the calculations, and while the outer extreme of that oyster farm might take up 10% of that outer harbor, the actual surface area of the individual grow boxes that they're using is considerably less by at least an order of magnitude. So we're now down to on the order of 1% of the harbor that might in fact be shaded, and 1%. And is that a good thing? No. But is it a horrible thing? I don't think so. Can we predict what's going to happen? Is it going to be good for the eelgrass in that immediate location? Probably not over the long term. Good. Okay. Is it going to disastrously affect the overall production and biota of the harbor? Probably not.
So let's hear it. The St. FX involvement. You're doing some studies there. I have a few students. What are they looking for?
Okay, well, there's two major components to these studies. The one that is most relevant to our application is a baseline study to determine existing conditions pre-farm So they've been out to take core samples, and they have monitors here looking at various different factors. And on the Buckenkeck site and Shandaff Oyster site in Merrimack Harbour, they're looking at the actual effect of farms in place. And the other component is to do a scientific comparison between our bobber technology, which is currently on Shandaff Oyster site and will be soon on the Buckenkeck site, to compare its operation and environmental impact to the existing commonly used growth units that are currently on both farms. With regard to the data collection on our proposed sites, the students came out on 2 occasions to collect core samples of the bottom. So it's like an 8-inch long, 4-inch in diameter core of the sediments. And so they went out just randomly to each of the 3 proposed sites, collected core samples on the first try, took them back to St. F.X., sieved them out for the contents so that they could identify what was there, and they found 0 eelgrass, which is very interesting discovery, that the eelgrass on these sites is so sparse that taking 10 cores didn't find any. So they came back a second time looking specifically for eelgrass, and they were able to find some. And the reason they're interested in the eelgrass is because it's a foundational species, and its response is very telling about, what are the environmental impacts. And Dr. Garbury is a sea plant specialist. He's very keenly interested in eelgrass, and he wants to study the epiphytes that are on the blades to see the effect of those. There's eelgrass wasting disease on the blades. He wants to understand what impacts may be observable related to that disease, on and on. They're measuring, monitoring actually, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and temperature through the whole range of the study, which is many months and over years. So they have that data set to apply to whatever they observe as the effects. As for the carbon sequestering, oysters do a fine little job of that. Each and every one of them sequesters carbon in their shell. Their shell is 12% carbon. That carbon comes from dissolved carbon dioxide that's in the water that dissolved there from the atmosphere. So in a roundabout way, oysters push back against greenhouse gases, adding solar to the nursery so that all the sequestering that takes place there isn't offset by carbon inputs. It's net benefit. Will we get to carbon positive? I don't know. I haven't done the study. But what we want to do is lead the way as best we can, and maybe other farmers will follow. And then as an industry, we have a measurable effect.
I think people are impressed at the notion that oysters sequester carbon, which is true. They sequester carbon, but the estuary already sequesters carbon. Eelgrass sequesters carbon. So if there's an effect on eelgrass, then you're losing one sequesterer and gaining another one perhaps. The other problem is that the the sequestering of carbon by the oysters is one little piece of what this project's effect will be on carbon. It's an industrial enterprise. He's, importing things from the rest of Canada. He's got a nursery. He's got, he plans. It's not in the application yet, but he plans to have a business selling equipment. All of these things have an effect on carbon. And when we asked about whether the statement about sequestering carbon was intended to indicate that the project would be project neutral, the answer is no. His answer was no. Yes, they sequester carbon. Does that mean that there'll be more or less carbon sequestered if the project weren't there? I think the answer is less, at least in the foreseeable future with existing technologies.
It was fascinating to hear many of the objections to this coming from friends of the harbour. And while many of those points have legitimacy in the sense that here is a worst case scenario, that it is possible that such and such could happen. It's possible that such and such could happen. It's possible that such and such could happen. Okay, it is possible. Okay. On the other hand, at that point, the project was in planning stages and had not gone through any serious approval at all, except that Town Point Consulting was given had a map of the harbour in which they were allowed to essentially inspect the harbour and evaluate it from the perspective of setting up a proposed oyster farm. And so I think we had, the fears of the community that suddenly, this huge chunk of the harbour was just going to disappear and create an eyesore, and B, an environmental hazard, and B, a major negative impact on the environment of the harbour. And and as I say, all of that is conceivable, okay? But as you go through the regulatory process, you can't just jump in and set up an oyster farm. It has to be evaluated. And it's evaluated, DFO has to have an input, and the province has to have an input, and the public has to have an input, and the local municipality has to have an input. Department of Transportation has to have an input. So all of those groups, those stakeholders essentially in the system, are able to essentially comment on this proposal in a formal way and ask, and then the experts at DFO and in the province can then decide, is this a viable project or not?
Well, the precautionary principle is something that I learned a long time ago, and it's built into a lot of DFO's regulations and whatnot, at least in theory, if not in practice. Unfortunately, you get political overtones here where it's ignored, and I don't think it should be, because when you have so many variables that it's hard to make predictions, and you're deliberately creating change that may be upsetting the system to the point where it starts to fall apart, you can wind up with a very slow deterioration, or you can wind up with a slow deterioration to a point where all of a sudden it's precipitous. It just drops right off and things just fall apart. And we're seeing a lot of that in the world right now. And believe me, there's no reason to not think that it couldn't happen in Antigonish Harbour.
We as Canadian citizens and our government have acknowledged that we are residing on unceded First Nations territory, and we need to respect that. And part of respecting it is involving First Nations in decisions about what happens with our natural resources and Crown land. So in our case, we did reach out to Buckinkeck First Nation group and spoke with some of their senior leaders, and Kerry Prosper was one of them, and he kindly shared with us some information that was very helpful. And it related to a pre-Confederation lease granted to the local band for a use of an oyster bed in Antigonish Harbour. And Kerry didn't have ready access to the document, but pointed me in the right direction. I was able to find it and include it in my application process. And also to determine that the areas that we ultimately applied for are in no way in conflict with the areas that they have designated in this pre-Confederation lease. The guide that NSDFA provides to applicants and is intended to inform the applicant of how to apply, what process you should follow, and what information should be provided, mentions that public engagement is an important part of the application process, but it does not spell out in any detail whatsoever how to do that. So the applicant is left to figure that out for themselves. What we did was we designed a form that would collect the who, when, where data and would draw out any questions, comments, or concerns. And so we would go take a concept plan out, go to a bunch of contacts, sit down with them, get this feedback, come back, revise the concept in response to that feedback, and then go out in a broader circle, more contacts, more feedback, and revise again. And we did that again and again and again until finally we achieved a state where we felt we had broad representation of what the community really felt about our proposal and had mitigated concerns, changed the design to accommodate the various other interests and other users, and then we had a collection of hundreds of, well, about 150 of these forms that then became a part of our application.
I was brought into this by a couple of people who are members or friends of the Antigonish Harbour. And they're friends of mine, and I have great respect for them. They are naturalists. They care very deeply about the environment. And I'd been away, I think, in New Zealand, or I'd been away, and suddenly they came to me and said, this project wants to take 10% of the harbour and put it in oysters. And we sat down in the building here. We had a meeting with 5 of us. You know, suddenly this huge block of the harbour was going to be given over to, or potentially given over to, oyster farming. And at the same time, in addition to being a biology professor, I was the coordinator of a program called Aquatic Resources. And Aquatic Resources is a interdisciplinary program at St. FX that essentially came about because of the collapse of the fisheries in the early 90s. And there was a desire to actually educate students in not only the science of water, but the sociology of water and the politics of water and the economics of water. And so I thought, from my perspective as the coordinator of this program, that if this is a serious issue, we should have some sort of serious public debate about this, or at least a presentation, so that everyone knows what's actually happening. And I thought that would be a much better way to proceed than having simple rumor and simply having, one environmental group, advocating for one side, and then we have industry in the sense of Town Point Consulting on the other side. So at the time, I was really pleased with the whole public panel, in that it definitely aired views, and for me, it raised a number of questions where the Friends of Antigonish Harbour had overstated their case in terms of, just because something is possible doesn't mean it will happen.
Part of my work in environmental assessment has been on consultation practice, on a continuum of barely acceptable to excellent consultation practice. I think holding a public meeting 45 minutes away from here, or including down Southside Harbour Road, where people are much closer to the project than I am, is a bit of a problem. There has not been, or there hadn't been, any written material at all on the project until the event at St. FX, although lots of people have been contacted on a one-to-one basis. And I guess, not everybody was told the same thing. And by the time we got to St. FX, I think a lot of people felt that what they've been told had been changed. I think the reporting of the consultation results in the application has been, I don't think that the consultation results have been accurately presented in the application. I can't understand how 87% of the community can be described as supportive of this project. I just see no evidence of that whatsoever. And FOA obviously has been working to document opposition to the project, and we're not seeing 13% opposed.
Yeah, misinformation, and perhaps some of it was just a system that wasn't worked out yet. All the plans, the business plan, when he first came around to all the neighbors, he was just a proposal. It was really more of an idea. And he'd been talking with, some other people in the industry that thought it was a good idea. And it sounded like a good idea until you think about it more and just don't know that it's a necessary, it's not an improvement to the harbour. It's not an improvement to the culture of the recreational culture, even to the rural culture, really. In this case, part of how, I guess, my objection is the scale. It's going to be, 400 anchors in the sea floor, thousands of cages, millions of oysters. I don't know, seems too big, seems industrial, seems a little bit like the farm next door, big industrial farm that once you do something like that, you can't go back. Once you tarnish the commons like that, there's no turning back. And as I said, for people like you, young people, the people that will eventually, even Town Point Consulting, the young people involved, the future will never, we have to leave somewhere unmarred, untouched, or else your children, our grandchildren, no one will remember what it was like to have a place that was clean, pure, non-industrial. And for the benefit, it's not that it would be untouched, it would still be enjoyed, it would still be so-called capitalized upon by things like the hiking trail next door, my son's eco-village, eco-lodge, further up the road, the harbors where there's recreational boating, the boat club, the rowing clubs, the kayakers. I mean, every day when the weather is good, there are people on the water.
If there's one thing that this has made me realize is that it's hardly a problem unique to Antigonish. By helping organize the Friends of Antigonish Harbour Facebook group, we've been put in touch with people from Black Point Beach and Owl's Head and places all over the province where communities are trying to organize to preserve public access to beaches and to water. So I really think that it is a provincial issue, and the government really has to start holding these developments accountable when they come in and they try to develop areas without proper consultation or consent of the communities that they're in. Yeah, so that was the sort of second thing that maybe eroded public trust, that they'd really respect public access. And yeah, there was the installation of pipes in the harbour for this land-based facility, cutting across the very public beach that people access via that road. Town Point Consulting has insisted that they actually just didn't know, that it was a mistake, because they had received a lease to have their land-based facility, and they say that they simply didn't know that they would need permits. It does, however, kind of strain the imagination to think that they wouldn't know that, because it says on the front page of their, or maybe not the front page, but it says in the lease, and I've seen it, that they are responsible for any laying of pipes and getting permits for any laying of pipes. It does seem like there is this incentive in the Nova Scotia government. They have some sort of incentive to encourage business at any cost and at any cost to local communities involved, because I think for most people who are, if they had done something without a permit, they then wouldn't be retroactive. If they broke the law, they wouldn't be retroactively granted permits. So it seems odd that the government is not willing to hold them accountable either.
So we had 17 months of learning from the guide and from a few interactions in person and on the phone with NSDFA people. And then this letter arrives that says the license is approved, but in there's one sentence that's a boilerplate sentence that would appear in many circumstances in many different letters. That basically said the proponent has the responsibility to follow all government protocols and obtain all necessary permits. I'm paraphrasing, but basically that was what it said. So I'm like, well, I don't know what other permits I need. So I called NSDFA and read that sentence to the person and said, okay, what other departments do I need to talk to and for what permits? And the answer I got was, no, you're good to go. So I'm, okay, thank you, hung up, and then I'm, for a day, pondering my fate, where I have this 17 months of understanding plus a verbal, no, you're good to go, countered by a letter that says something different. So I'm feeling like I'm hung out to dry here. So I write an email back to the person that told me I was good to go, saying, thank you for confirming that I do not need to seek any other permits beyond that required by the municipal government. Sent that off. There was other stuff in the email. And then I feel like, okay, I'm on side permitting-wise. No response to that email. 2 months goes by, and then I start building, and permitting is out of my mind. And only after the facility is partially constructed and the pipes are installed do I find out that there was this obscure permit for work on Crown land that was a missed step. And I found out because 2 people showed up here, one from Lands and Forests and the other environment conservation officer, who showed up because there was a complaint, and they had an obligation to respond to the complaint. And they looked at the work and said, well, there's no problem with the work. Let's look at the permit. And that's when we discovered a gap in the permitting. So they decided to investigate this issue so that the same problem wouldn't happen again. And they looked at the documentation, got a statement from me, went away, came back and had me swear to that statement. Fair enough. And then that was the last I've seen of them. And then 6 or 7 months later, the person who was doing this investigation called me to say that he was through with it and there was no wrongdoing found and that the permit was soon to arrive. And that's the whole story on the permitting.
So have you been granted the retroactive permit for the pipes?
No, now what they have decided is that they, and I've questioned this, where's the sense in it? They've decided that they will provide me with a lease agreement instead of a permit, so that I get to pay rent on that little bit of beach where the pipes cross the beach. And when I mentioned this to highly placed people in the Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture, they were surprised to hear that there would be a lease requirement. So here we have people in government not knowing the same things that I didn't know.
So in practice, all kinds of people use the boat club to access the harbor. They mostly just go out and hang out there, often ignoring our garbage cans when they leave. But again, as I mentioned, there is a cost to maintaining the boat ramp, the road in, and everything about the place. So ideally, people would become members. Our fee is very low. It's $75 for a family for a year, and we do that intentionally to keep it very inclusive. For whatever reason, Antigonish County, at least at this point, hasn't chosen to secure a fully public access to Antigonish Harbour. I think you can also get on the harbour down around the Mount Cameron development, but there's no obvious place to do it. And I don't know, like that roadway along that area is an old public road, much in the same way I think that the one on Mr. Porter's land is, but they're not maintained as a place where you can drive a car.
Only now that we've put forward a proposal to do oyster aquaculture has anyone shown any interest in that piece of property. And it's just a proxy for opposing oysters. Nothing more than that. We own land on 3 sides of this Crown land. So it's not like it goes anywhere. There's a couple of points where you could access the shore without crossing our property, but you'd have to be pretty aware of where they are. They're not obvious. If you were just a member of the public coming down there, you'd likely end up trespassing on our property. So it's not the way it's being characterized as some commonly used access point to a beautiful beach. First of all, there's no beautiful beach there, and it has not been in common use.
As someone who previously worked in the planning realm, where a big part of what you do is about managing change, because that's what really planning is all about, is managing change. And people don't like change. And so it's a question always about looking at, what are our community goals and objectives? How are we going to achieve those goals and objectives within a changing world? And how do we mitigate the concerns? And so there has to be a good, honest dialogue about that. I'm not sure that throughout this whole process that has been the case. I think that there's been a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding. And so it's great that you guys are doing this. It's great that the CLC exists as an organization which, regardless of the positions of the members on the organization, they're tasked with being objective and not subjective. And so I think that the people who are on it understand that and will do their very best to make sure that any information that flows in or out of that organization is treated respectfully and in a transparent fashion. So I think that's really important. But I also, I do hope that people will think a little bit more about the fact that in Nova Scotia, we sometimes do have to stretch and we do have to change, because we don't live in the world we lived in 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And those changes may in some ways represent what they might view as a compromise to their lifestyle that they have looked for and sought. And particularly when you've got people coming here from other areas that expect it to be in stasis. Like, I want to move or have a summer property in this place and never have it change. I want it to be pristine and just the way I found it forever, regardless of the cost to the community around me. And so hopefully we'll get to a place where we understand that this is a shared thing and that we're all working towards some common objectives here. And it's not just the views and the recreational aspects. It's all of these other things that we've spoken about today.
Okay, you're correct. CLC is an important component of what we're attempting to do. And it came to be because of a concern we had that for quite some time now, the predominant source of information in the community was that emanating from a small group of people who formed a Facebook group and were pushing out a narrative that sought to cast our proposal in a dim light, and our character, there were aspersions being made about our character, which is really disappointing. But so that was, we felt the community was being disturbed by that being the principal source of information. So to correct that and to provide to the community science-based facts and the truth about what we hope to do, the advice was that the best way to do that was to have a community liaison committee. So we looked into what this sort of entity is and how you form it, and it turns out the Department of Environment have a guideline for establishment and operation of a community liaison committee. So we learned how that works, followed those guidelines and the guidelines permit the proponent to select the committee chairman and the co-chairman. We went out and did that, and then we advertised publicly on the radio, bulletins around town, on our websites, and various other ways for the opportunity for people to apply to serve on this committee. And we were really pleased with the response. So that committee was formed and has had several meetings now. They have become intimately aware of our proposal in detail, and with regard to what an oyster farm is, how we would operate it, what the science behind these operations are, the environmental impacts, positive and negative, the socioeconomic impacts, all of these details these committee members are now aware of.
So it should be under 100 acres, about 90 acres. And on the one hand, that might seem kind of insignificant in a harbor that's of a few thousand acres, but it's actually taking up a really critical part of the harbor for a lot of people. Our harbor is extremely shallow. It's very difficult to navigate by boat. And this 100 acres is going to be right at the mouth of the harbor, where virtually all boaters who use the harbor need to navigate to, and it will potentially be taking up the deepest waters, which we need for navigating. Since it was originally proposed to be right by Captain's Harbor, and we immediately noticed that it was kind of impossible, since then the application's been published, it has already moved. It's moved into our navigable waterway, because that is where the navigable waterways are basically the only places deep enough for any sort of oyster aquaculture development. So yeah, given that since we first met with the developer to now, there's already been a shift in where the development was supposed to happen and into our waterways, we are concerned that it will continue to shift and move into the places that people need to get around the harbor.
We also heard the concern of that our proposed lease areas would be infringing on navigation, but understand that for 18 years we've been boating on this harbor and observing boating activities on this harbor, so we're well aware of the frequency and intensity of boating and where boaters generally go. So we use that knowledge to specifically select locations that are out of the way of normal boating usage and do not impact on navigation routes. So that's how we set up our proposal. And then after hearing this concern, we reached out to Transport Canada, their Navigable Waters Protection Program people, to discuss with them what their criteria are and to confirm that our proposal meets their rules and regulations. And they confirmed that it does. And ultimately, as that network partner reviews our application, and we think they already have, they're the ones who will assess it based on their rules and regulations, not based on what we would have to say or anyone else. And they're the ultimate authority, and they will make that decision.
I've spent some time living on the waterfront in the city, and when you see all of the kinds of things that go on that harbor, it's very much a working harbor. And you know, if you're there on the evenings or the weekends, you don't see this very much, but in the daytime, it's full of all kinds of vessels that are working. I was working on a project at King's Wharf on the Dartmouth waterfront, and we have a little cove in front of that development. There were guys putting lobster traps down right inside our cove. And it's just amazing to see what goes on through the daytime. And I really enjoyed seeing that kind of that hustle and bustle of the entrepreneurial spirit that you were seeing going on there. By contrast to Antigonish Harbour, which generally speaking, when I'm out on the water there, I'm the only one. Like, it's amazing how little it's used. And so seeing people out fishing, seeing people out canoeing, kayaking, seeing the little service machine, or I don't know what you call it, it's kind of a crazy contraption that they've invented to work with the bobbers. It's kind of a bit of genius engineering. I think that it'd be fascinating to watch that happening. And one of the things I find as a recreational boater is that it's more interesting to have things to, in some fashion, come up to or go by or look at. And so the notion that this will despoil the harbour in some fashion, I kind of don't buy that, especially where the bobbers have a very low profile. And the areas where they're going to go are not areas where I would, particularly in a sailboat, I wouldn't choose to go there in a sailboat because the chance of striking would be incredibly high. There's one corner on the lease, kind of in front of his property, that would be navigable water if you're sailing, but it's just a little corner, and frankly, when you're out, especially in a small boat, you don't know how close you're getting to that shoal unless you've got navigational equipment. And I was never going out as far as that was going to be anyway. Now I'll actually have a better sense of where I can and can't go because it will be somewhat defined by that corner of the array of bobbers.
You know, I know that there's a lot of innovation in the methodology that is planned, but it's an untried methodology. I am concerned about the harm done with anchors, with equipment. So what happens if another Hurricane Dorian comes through, which is going to? There's no doubt about it. Does everything get taken out? I don't know. There's been, in the assumption, I read nothing about contingency for loss of gear or broken gear, or we own, 2,000 feet of waterfront. What happens if all this plastic gear shows up on the far side of our island and we don't even know it's there?
Well, the technology he wants to use is original technology. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about this project, that Mr. Porter, as an engineer, has looked at this industry and essentially felt that he could do it better. And so he has designed specific cages and ways of putting out those cages that I would say are highly innovative. Are they going to be affected by storm surge more than any other system that's out there? I suspect not. I mean, most of that farm is going to be on the lee side of Captain's Island, and so the location of it, to me, looks pretty safe from storm action.
Ernie, I think, is not someone who can sit still. He wants to have a project at all times. He then broke it all down and said, okay, what are the issues? What are the challenges? And certainly, from what I understand, there are some real challenges with farming oysters, and particularly in terms of manpower or person power. It's a really demanding job. And so they said, okay, well, how can we make it work better? How can we make it so that in Nova Scotia, in the context of Nova Scotia, we can do a better job of this? And struggle less with getting the manpower we need at the right times of the year during the right kinds of weather and everything else to, keep the farm operational. And so they also looked at, I think, the aesthetic aspect. They looked at the resilience in storms and what can we do about that. And taking it all together, they came up with this new system of these cylindrical cages and the machine that can help with all the different operations that they have. We can't just sit and do the same thing over and over again, particularly as our world changes around us. We've got to kind of step back once in a while and rethink things. And he's done, I think, from what I understand at least, a masterful job of that.
This is the new technology that we've developed. It's bobber, B-O-B-R, that stands for benefit of being round. It's a cylinder, and the cylindrical shape can be mechanized. So the purpose of these traction rings here is to engage with a machine that enables this to do the various husbandry tasks. This is the float, that's our bobber float, proprietary float, that's what suspends the unit. The cage is deployed horizontally, and it on two static lines, and it forms basically a ladder configuration. Another benefit is that this has a much lower visual profile than the competing equipment. Because the float is inside it and not underneath of it, it floats basically at half the diameter of the float, which is about 1 inch to 1.5 inches showing above the water. Instead of with the competing gear, it's from 8 to 16 inches and a much more bulky item. So this it floats at that low height, and it's only when it's on the machine is it higher. Bobber has been in use at Shandaf Oysters since August 2019. There's been 1,000 units on that site. This summer, 2,000 more will be installed there. We're patiently waiting for the shipping industry to get its act sorted out so that delivery can be made. And then we'll have 3,000 deployed on that farm, which starts to replicate farm scale operations. And Philip and his farm hands are really pleased with how Bobber functions. The quality of the product coming out of it is superior to the other technology they have there, and it's far less work. So they're really happy with it.
I think there are two elements of this. One is the risk. Something may or may not happen. And then there will be effects on other people, other users of the harbor, whether they're recreational or economic users. I think the implication that this is a good use of marine resources ignores the number of people whose livelihoods can be affected by what's happening in the harbor. If there are lots of undeveloped properties around those there, that if those aren't developed, then there's tax implications for the county. There's less work for realtors, for construction workers. People are renting out houses and cottages around the outer harbor, so that's an economic use. We have not only recreational fishermen may not sound important, but a lot of these people are feeding their families with the fish that they catch, or the eels that they catch, or the smelt out here. They're not fishing them and throwing them back. They're taking them home and eating them. So there is a lot of economic use of the harbor, and whether this one individual's economic use is worth more than all the other economic uses that either exist and will struggle if that farm is there, or may exist in the future in a much less invasive way. I believe there are a couple of people that are thinking about other activities that could go on, commercial activities that could go on in the outer harbor. So you add that to environmental risk, health and safety risk, and you have to ask what is the benefit that warrants all this disruption and risk?
Yeah, there's always this appeal of having new local foods, but that just misrepresents that we already have a lot of local food coming out of this harbor. There are 750,000 oysters harvested each year from the harbor from small-scale, very sustainable local oyster fishermen. So if there's already this amount of oysters coming out of the harbor, what market are they looking for? It seems to me that this isn't filling a local need, but probably just filling a need or a market abroad.
There will be economic benefits certainly for the proponent. I think that they are overstated. For Antigonish, this is a big project, a big disruption of traditional use of the harbor. But in terms of economic benefits to Nova Scotia, it's very small. And not to say that the economy of the province doesn't depend on a lot of small activities, but this particular one, given the risks, the impacts, I don't think that it will make such a contribution to the Nova Scotia economy that it's worth taking so much from so many other people.
I mean, what jumps to mind immediately is that we have a lot of crown land, which is common land in Nova Scotia, which is used for forestry. There are mining operations on it. There are any number of private organizations taking advantage of crown lands, and in doing so making it less suitable as sort of recreational land. And so it's not as though this is a new thing. It's something that's been going on for, probably a century or so in this way, and in, I would suggest, far more disruptive ways than having what does it, the bobbers occupied under 1%, I think, when you look at the math of the harbour. Yeah. And so when you travel around Nova Scotia, you do see some little harbours which are just about completely occupied by aquaculture. And it's like, yeah, that's a lot. That's too much, because it really does strip away the ability to use that for leisure purposes. But on the other hand, our province as a whole, again, look at the One Nova Scotia, what people call the Ivany Report.
Ivany said, "Do it now, or you're dead." It was made that plain. He said, "You've got to change the way that you do things." He implied that we are laggards. We're not leaders.
We can't just be out recreating all the time. We have to actually make money in order to pay taxes, in order to support recreational services and hospitals and educational services and transportation and everything else. So you've got to find a balance somehow. This is not a huge amount of harbour that would be occupied by this. It's a pretty small amount. Our resources are for many different purposes, and I think that finding ways to use them in a kind of a balanced way, in a sustainable and a resilient way, is what we have to do, and that the dialogue around that's, I think, important. And so this project that you're doing, I think, is a little bit about that. It's like, how are we using this resource that's here for everyone, and what is a reasonable way to use it?
I'm really torn here. And I'm torn in the sense that, well, wouldn't it be great if we had a harbor, a major estuary, that we were just going to let be pristine, that we weren't going to industrialize, that we weren't going to develop economically? To me, that, well, why couldn't that be Antigonish Harbour? Okay, so there's one sort of extreme of where I'm coming from. Now, the other extreme is, it's not even an extreme, the other sort of part of this is, we have a legal process here. We have a need for the government to promote industry. We have a need for jobs. We have a need for, economic development in this part of the world. And, we have to, I think, balance the need for, extreme caution in terms of the potential effects of this with, on the other hand, the need for economic development if it can be done safely. And it is the job of the federal regulators and the provincial regulators and the people who issue all the permits to ensure that, A, the rules are followed, and that this is going to be a benefit to the community and to the province without, destroying that environment. I think that's where we are now, that the proposal is essentially complete, and there will be an opportunity for additional public engagement in this.